The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, and civil rights. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Hugh Price, who's president of the National Urban League, one of the preeminent civil rights organizations in this country, in the nation, in the world. As we prepare to enter the 21st century, Hugh, what are the priorities for the National Urban League? Because the National Urban League is part of the big three, the big four, the big five of civil rights organizations in this country.
We were founded in 1910 to help our folks who are moving from the rural South to the cities of this country.
A year after the NAACP
right after we were the younger
in
sibling.
1999.
We're the younger sibling. And we were founded to help people who were moving to the cities from the farms cross over into the mainstream. People who arrived in town needed a job, needed help getting a house, came to the Urban League. And our mission remains promoting the economic and social equality of our folks, and particularly focusing on people who are striving toward the mainstream, helping them become economically self-reliant through preparing our children to be competitive, helping the parents become self-sufficient through home ownership and jobs and entrepreneurship, and thirdly, promoting racial inclusion so that the opportunity structure is open. As we all know from current events, there's a fair amount of work still to be done on all those fronts.
Now, the Urban League focused initially on African Americans,
Right.
But what about some of the rural whites who were coming? Was that part of the mission of the Urban League?
Initially, the league was principally African American in focus, and it remains principally, but not exclusively by any stretch of the imagination. I have visited now probably 85 urban leagues, and when you walk in the doors of a real urban league on the ground, you'll see whites, Latinos, Asians, black folks. You know, if you need a job, you need to get over, if you've been downsized, dislodged or whatever, or if you've never worked, the league has got something to offer. So we don't bar the door to any groups. We are predominantly focused on African Americans, but as I say, not exclusively.
The essential difference between the NAACP and the Urban League is the NAACP focused on the legal aspect of the civil rights struggle, the protest aspect, and the Urban League focused on those equal opportunity things in housing and education and in jobs.
Yeah, we consider ourselves a social services and civil rights organization, and the heavy focus has been on the direct services that lead people toward economic self-reliance. And I think that we've sort of got a division of labor between the two organizations and a lot of complementarity in what we do. The NAACP is by and large a massive volunteer movement with offices around the country and many, many more places than we have, but basically on call to mobilize when necessary. We are essentially there day in and day out, operating programs, delivering services, and dealing with a lot of policy issues. So I say there's a lot of complementarity in what we do.
Well, the recent Texaco incident involving discrimination of high order, including tapes, both the Urban League and the NAACP and the African American ministers and
the Rainbow Coalition,
many other groups
just
moved, and Operation Push Jesse Jackson moved into that because it's discrimination, yes, but also it's economic, and yet also it's illegal.
Right. There was a really interesting example of the movement working again in some wonderful ways. There was a lot of discussion about who ought to do what. We of the League, for example, don't engage in boycotts, but we understood why a boycott was necessary. We were heavily involved in the research and advocacy. We each played our roles in dealing with the press. And basically, Texaco, as it looked around the civil rights movement, found there was no escape route. You know, they had to deal with the issue on the merits. Now, to his credit, the new CEO of Texaco, Peter Berger, said, I don't want this happening on my watch, and I want to move toward becoming the kind of corporation we ought to be rather than just trying to defend what we have been. The focus in the negotiations with Texaco has been on settling the lawsuit as quickly as possible, which of course has now happened, but also looking at what we've called two tracks of remedies that they've got to introduce. One track has to do with economic opportunity, or the opportunity track, and the other has to do with the attitude track. And what we said in meeting with the CEO a week ago was that on the opportunity track, you've got to look at increased minority subcontracting and outsourcing. You've got to look at increased minority ownership of your franchises, and obviously hiring and promotion, not just in the entry levels or the middle management levels, but all the way to the top, because the only way you stop the kind of stuff that was happening in Texaco is if you have very different people, minorities and women, and a different sensibility. The other thing we said was that there's also an attitude track that you've got to deal with. And we urge them to accelerate their diversity training programs and get even better at it. Secondly, we said you need to create some checkpoints throughout your organization so that you catch these behaviors when they happen and so that they don't end up in litigation. And thirdly, we said you really ought to look at state-of-the-art corporate examples of performance and incentive reviews for managers that take into account not only what your hiring practices are, but how well you manage a diverse team. Can you manage a diverse team so that it's both harmonious and productive? And that should go on the scale in weighing a bonus that a manager gets. He was very interested in that, and we said, you know, you'll look at a lot of corporate best practice in these areas, and I think we haven't heard the last from Texaco by any stretch of the imagination.
And I don't think you've heard last from a lot of other corporations,
that's
because as I understand it, Texaco may not have been the worst of some of the corporate practices going on. But see, diversity is the watchword of the 21st century. By 2040, 2045, half the country will be people of color. Corporations, businesses, universities, government cannot work without total inclusion of the entire spectrum, as Jesse Jackson says, the entire rainbow of America. So this is really a test. It's almost like 1909, 1910, 1912, when the Trust Act came in, the antitrust. The corporation was just destroying the environment, destroying people, taking money and so on. And all of a sudden, the courts and Theodore Roosevelt say, no, we're going to stop this. And you got the Antitrust Act so that people can't get ripped off. Same thing in 1929, the Securities Exchange Commission.
A lot of the argument for affirmative action and inclusion has been based on past patterns of discrimination, and clearly discrimination persists, and you've got to deal with it on that basis. We've been developing the argument that as you look prospectively, as you just said, and where your workers are going to come from, you've got to make sure that your workforce is as fully developed as possible so they can carry as heavy an economic load as possible. Some years ago, there was something like 7 workers earning salaries and paying taxes for every Social Security recipient. By the time I become retired in about 10 years, it's going to be 3.
That's right.
Now, I want all of those folks to be as highly educated as possible so they can earn as much money as possible so they can help carry my Medicaid, my Medicare, and Social Security. I think City University has actually made a major contribution to our understanding about the importance in investing in diversity, and it hasn't gotten a lot of attention. The open admissions policy at City University opened up this school to all sorts of folks who nobody thought were college material. And I'm sure you're aware of the study that came out not long ago, which said that, which said that I don't know, maybe 100,000 people got in who would not have gotten in. Half of them finished their, got their degrees. It may have taken them 7 years instead of 4, but as you and I know, what difference does that make? That just means you're going to work for 55 years instead of 52 years when you're done. And in 1 year alone, those folks earned $67 million more than they would have had they not gone to CUNY and gotten a college degree. And over their lifetimes, they earned $2 billion more. What that means is that business community in New York City got much more productive workers than they would have had those folks not gone to CUNY. And taxpayers in New York had somebody to share more of the load than they would have had they not earned as much money. Now that's in society's interest. And every so often, somebody really breaks through. Ivan Seidenberg, the chair of NYNEX, is an open admissions graduate. I don't know if you knew that. But Ivan flunked out of college when he first got out of high school, went to Vietnam, came back, worked as a linesman in the telephone company, got into CUNY under open admissions because he didn't have the grades otherwise, but he had the potential. He took him 7 or 8 years to get his BA, took him another 3 or 4 years to get his master's, and he runs NYNEX.
It's very interesting. You and that study undercuts one of the chivalrous about open admission, that it was to get unqualified black and Latinos in, where over half of the people who benefited from this were people from European and other communities.
Well, it was to get people with potential.
To get people with potential to come up. Right. And of course, this gets into the whole thing. I know the urban thing is very much education. Education in the 19th and even the 20th century has been a gatekeeper. It has determined who gets into the middle class of society, the upper class of society. Those days are gone now because of the technology, because of the time frame to move from A to B. It's interesting. I look at some of these young folks that I knew when they were in college, and now some of them are millionaires 10 years after they graduate because they go into business or stock market or entertainment or what have you. Yet, in the urban schools in this country, minority kids, particularly black kids, do not get a quality education.
Right.
Some of it is funding, some of it is curriculum, but I think the most part of it is attitude. I think the larger society has not been willing to pay the price to help those young people that they pay the price to help people in the upper class suburbs. Urban League has taken a very strong position,
Right.
National Urban League,
Right.
on education. Could you tell us about some of the things that you're trying to do with education?
Well, there's several things. We're trying to first help people understand, and particularly our community, understand that the academic bar has been set higher than ever before, and our children got to get up over the bar, or else they're going to live in poverty the rest of their lives. I mean, you and I know that's the way the economy is moving. And we've then got to know what it takes to get the kids over the bar, and what we as parents have to do, what we as community leaders have to do, and what we as the children's principal advocates have got to get the schools to do. Now, in fairness to the schools, I think we need to point out that we're asking schools to do something we've never asked them to do before. When you were coming along in school, when I was coming along in school, I know when I was in school in the 40s and the 50s, basically we asked the schools to do a good job with the kids who sat in front of the class. If the kids who sat in the back, they just said, be quiet, don't disrupt things, and when you're 16, if it's not going well, you can drop out and go into the Army, you can go back to the farm, you can go in the factory. And our schools didn't keep count of the reading scores and the dropout rates, because, you know, it was okay. There was some place for you to go if school didn't work out. Well, you can't go anywhere now economically if school doesn't work out. So we're asking the schools now to serve all children, not just some children, and we're saying that all children who come out of school have got to achieve at a much higher level of proficiency than ever before. Now, some may say, well, that's unfair to ask schools to do that, but that's life. You know, corporations have to do things they never had to do before. The challenge is going to be whether the schools rise to the new expectations of them. And the key is for we now have the knowledge base to be able to say that if the parents and the community groups, the teachers and the elected officials do what they're supposed to do, the children can do what we expect of them. Don Stewart, who's the president of the College Board, former president of Spelman College, launched a program 6 years ago called Equity 2000, in which they got a bunch of school districts, urban districts, to agree to require that all children take algebra, all middle schoolers, because they said that's the gatekeeper to whether or not you can go to college. And then they said, we're going to find out what it takes to get the kids up over the algebra bar. 6 years later, they have discovered that if the adults get their acts together, vastly more of our children are capable of achieving at much higher levels than ever before. So the monkey really is on the backs of the adults, not on the backs of the kids.
Well, it's also on the backs of the politicians, because
Oh, yeah.
one of the things
Those are among the adults I'm talking about.
that you know is the inequity of funding between urban schools and suburban schools. There are many, many suits, maybe you folks have joined in with them, to challenge those various funding formulas. And what you get back is, well, we give them more money, they'll spend it in the same old way, nothing will happen. That's, of course, a self-fulfilling prophecy that the data don't bear out. When you give them more money, you do get smaller class size, you do get a better curriculum, you do get more textbooks, and you do get better performance.
There are three equity issues in education as we head into the 21st century. The first is, do urban schools have decent teachers? Linda Darling-Hammond and Governor Jim Hunt just issued a big report called Teaching in America's Future. And they found that half of America's teachers who are teaching math didn't even major or minor in math.
That's urban or suburban.
Urban and suburban, so you know what the deal is in the inner city. A quarter of the teachers are not properly prepared. So if the children in the schools don't have teachers that are properly trained and equipped to teach them, you're not going to get good education. And that's largely a money issue, particularly in math and sciences. Second equity issue is, are children in the inner city being given access to what might be called challenging academic material? Are they being challenged to take algebra? And the third equity
And you can't
issue,
do that if you don't have teachers who can teach it. Right.
and the third equity issue is technology, which is also a money issue. So what we at the League are doing is helping to educate our constituency, the parents, the church leaders, et cetera, about what the deal is and what they as parents need to do in the home to support children, because we can't just say, well, those teachers have got to do it, and what we can do as advocates for our kids to, and as taxpayers, to say, we insist that the adults in their lives do what they're supposed to do for the children.
Well, one of the things that is really avant-garde is what we call small schools,
Right.
community-based schools where
Right.
the parents and the teachers and administrators work together to set the goals for the schools and assume the responsibility for accountability.
Right.
Indeed, there's a national project, the Annenberg Project, which
Right.
exists in 5 or 6 cities to accomplish this. And I know the Urban League is working with some of those schools. So what are
Right.
some of the things that you actually do in your programs to help schools?
Well, some of our urban leagues are actually operating charter schools. In San Diego and Miami, they've actually started their own small schools, and we have a long history of operating street academies.
Oh, for a long time
for
in New
young
York City,
people who
right.
aren't, having a tough time in regular schools. Many of our urban leagues also operate after-school programs for math enhancement programs, computer enhancement programs. So we're complementing what happens in the schools. What the National Urban League is focusing increasingly on is several things. We're trying to make sure that the fraternities and sororities and the Eastern Star and the Masons and the churches understand where the academic bar has been set, and we're real clear about the fact that our kids have got to get up over the bar. So we're doing a lot of mobilizing and organizing work around that. Second thing is that we're mobilizing community to celebrate children who do the right thing, because they don't get enough reinforcement from us.
I know you've talked about that in your previous
But September
existence
21st,
as
all
a-
across the country,
Right.
our urban league staged block parties, street festivals, parades. We had one right here, Martin Luther King High School. It was terrific. The third thing we're doing is trying to make sure people understand how important the after-school hours are in the lives of kids, because the hours from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock are prime time for teen sex and teen crime. But if we can get them in after-school programs like those we operate, or the boys' clubs, or YMCAs, or the Reedland Centers, or whatever, you can increase the academic performance of kids and curb their involvement in those kinds of activities. So it's very important. I read an article about the hiring practices of the American automobile industry. And Detroit's going to be hiring 170,000 new auto workers in the next 7 years. To get a job as an auto worker today, you got to pass a math test, a reading test, and a spatial relations test. Then you got to pass a drug test. Then if you pass all those tests, they take groups of 5 people who pass all those tests, assign them in a team. They give them a description of a part of the assembly line in the plant, plus the description of all the jobs on the assembly line. And they give them 3 hours to come up with recommendations for improving the productivity of the assembly line. So you've got to be able to function as a team.
And that really means post-high school, post-secondary
I'm
education.
telling you.
That's at least community college
telling you.
education, probably a bachelor's degree.
It used to be to work as an auto worker, all you had to do was operate a remote spray thing or lift up some bumpers and bolt on some fenders. That's not good enough now as an entry-level auto worker. That's what we're trying to make sure our folks understand.
Well, what about the relationship between public and private funding? One of the things that we hear over and over again is that the public has wasted money on education, et cetera. You and I know that the United States spends less money on public education than the 11 industrialized nations of the world.
Right.
How do we get past that? We know just from looking at our colleges in the East that the private colleges or private schools are supposed to be better, et cetera, but they only educate and parochial schools as well, a small percent, 10, 11, 12%. How do we get the attention of our tax-paying public to recognize there's no free lunch as far as education is
We've got
concerned?
a lot of work to do on that front. That's one of the things we're working on. We're in the spring, we're going to be convening the heads of the major church denominations and fraternities and sororities to say, as we as parents and taxpayers have got to insist that we invest in education, and we've got to insist that the schools stay open after school so the kids have some place safe to be. We've got to get to the people who don't have any children in the schools. Now, one of the most telling ways of getting at them is to say, look at all the money we're pouring down the criminal justice system. And nobody wants dangerous cities. We've got to have police protection. But in California, I am told that the state budget for prisons is now was 2% of the entire budget. It's now 10% of the entire budget. It exceeds the state outlays for the best public university system in the country. And it's en route, as that whole 3 strikes and you're out thing kicks in, it's en route to become an 18% of the state budget. Now, how can California be competitive as a state if it's spending more money locking up people than it is educating them?
You're recognizing the fact that the best criminal justice system educates people
That's
rather
right.
than punishes them.
That's right.
And of course, that has to do with something about our attitude toward people.
Yeah.
That when somebody makes a mistake, they really ought to be whacked, except that it's unequal. The people in the white-collar crime, the upper class, don't get into prison.
Well, there's some really bad actors who've got to be locked up and who are really dangerous people. But what we don't do nearly enough of is work on the front end to keep the kids out of the system.
Or if they begin to get in the system, to pull them back, like the Boys and Girls Club and the YMCA tried to do.
That's right.
Let me change and ask an interesting question about how black people are viewed and how black people view themselves. Who would you think are the best role models for African American youth from among this wide spectrum of African Americans of notoriety or people?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I don't know that African Americans of notoriety are the best role models.
Exactly.
I really think we've got to bring heroism closer to home.
Exactly, I agree with that.
And I would like the postal workers and the school teachers and the office workers, the people who make it day in and day out, to become our heroes again. Because, you know, otherwise this is very remote. It's very remote financially. Only a thimbleful of kids make it through the filter to become the superstars. Yet if that's their frame of reference, they don't have a prayer.
They don't. But see, the black press, when you and I were in school, was the place where the average role model, the postal worker, the doctor, the police officer, the teacher, somebody who's doing good, was written about, and kids could see. Today, what you see is superstars on television all the time.
Well, it's one of the reasons the Urban League at our annual dinners, we just had one last week, we honor what we call community heroes. Last year we honored Osceola McCarty, the laundress who, amazing, she's the Rosa Parks of the 1990s.
That's right.
She had saved up her money, she's 86 years old, and she gave away $150,000. She didn't even know how much money she had. When she talked to the estate attorneys, they said, what do you want to do with your money? She said, I don't even know how much I have. They gave her a bunch of dimes, one dime for every $10,000. They said, I want you to put as many dimes in this pile for this and that pile for that and that pile for the other. Turned out she had $150,000 she gave for scholarships. This year we honored a man by the name of Mattel Dawson, auto worker out of Detroit, 75 years old, still works. The man has given away $700,000 for scholarships. Now that's who our heroes ought to be.
That's right.
That's who our heroes ought to be. And that's why we are honoring them. And also our children who are doing the right thing should be our heroes. When we did that celebratory event at Martin Luther King School, he was a 15-year-old who'd been involved in community service in his school. His peers came up to him afterwards and asked him to sign autographs.
That's wonderful.
You see? And one of the kids we honored in Dallas was a youngster who goes to his church every weekend and cleans the grounds because he wants the church to make a statement to the community about how much it respects it. So we've got to bring heroism back down to home and back to reality if our children are going to have any chance of succeeding.
One way of doing it is to get one of these Major League Sports teams to put your promos on the air after each inning or after each quarter, so that they can understand that the average persons are the heroes.
That's right. That's right.
Also, the press. The press, particularly now that we don't have the African American press in this larger amount, the press has a tremendous responsibility in carrying these stories. And I know you worked at the New York Times for a while. How do you think they're coming? You think they're aware of the need to do this?
It's in and out. I remember a conversation I had with an editor who's an old friend at a paper that shall go nameless, and she said to me that they wanted to print more positive stories on blacks. And I said, I've got a dynamite story for you. It's about a black family that lives in Mount Vernon and pays taxes. And she said, oh, no, that's not the kind of story I want. I said, I know that's not the kind of story
That's exactly the point.
They wanted an up from pathology story, all right? Now, we had a successful experience in helping the press think about the Million Man March. I was on a trip around the world with the editors of Time magazine, and we talked about how to cover the march. And I said, you can cover it two ways. You can either cover Farrakhan, or you can figure out why the black men and boys from Queens, from St. Albans came. Why did they come? What did they come in search of? And so interestingly enough, there was an issue of Newsweek in Time the same week after the march. I don't know if you remember this. The cover of Newsweek was a black and white photo of Farrakhan, half in darkness, half in light. The two faces of Farrakhan, what lies ahead for America, black America, separatism or integration. Now, I don't know more than a handful of people who think seriously about separatism, so that was sort of a non-issue. The cover story in Time, which Janetta Cole and I really, I think, had some influence on was a full-color, magnificent photo of men and boys in ties. We, too, search for America. So you just got to keep working at it, and got to create alternative methods to get the message out. And thanks to technology, that's possible. And then if you get the message out, the challenge is the marketing challenge of how do you bring people to your message. But you know, it never stops. But I will say that when we celebrated the children who do the right thing, we got a tremendous amount of media coverage all over the country, which was the point.
We've been talking with Hugh Price, who's president of the National Urban League on African American Legends. And you can see from our discussion that Hugh Price himself is a legend. But more than that, he leads us to that average African American who is doing something, contributing to our society, and also a legend. Thanks again, Hugh, for being with us today.